shall we? A very private public citizen, the life of Grenville Clark. For those of you who haven't been following along until now, that is my great-grandfather, who wrote the New World Order, no less. Chapter 13, Uneasy Peace, the 1950s. Grenville Clark's pre-ultimate decade opened with a jittery and divided world on the brink of a third world war. On June 25th, 1950, 4 short years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, communist North Korea invaded quasi-democratic South Korea. Predictably, the United States and the United Nations came to the aid of the South, while the Soviet Union and China variously backed the North. It was the first dramatic instance of what the historian Stephen Ambrose describes as the Cold War flaring hot. Many observers feared it could be the last, with the nuclear arms race now officially underway. The Soviets had shocked the West the year before by successfully exploding their first atomic bomb. The United States responded by fast-tracking development of the 1,000 times more lethal hydrogen bomb, and what the nuclear physicist Herbert York later called the race to oblivion was on. Close parentheses. Meanwhile, the fragile new United Nations organization was being sorely tested. In 1949, Mao's Communist Army had emerged victorious in China's long and torturous civil war, but the United Nations refused to acknowledge the new government or to oust the former Chinese nationalist government, which had fled to Taiwan, from the Security Council. The Soviet Union boycotted its own Security Council seat in protest, a move that backfired when, in the Soviets' absence, the other members approved a resolution backing South Korea. Alan Cranston sought Clark's counsel in making sense of the turbulent international scene. Nothing that World War II had begun in remote places like Manchuria and Ethiopia, Cranston wrote to Clark. There are those in Washington and elsewhere who believe that World War III has now started in Korea. Clark was, of course, deeply concerned about the events unfolding on the Korean peninsula. But for someone who had worked so strenuously to prevent precisely what seemed to be happening, his immediate reaction was surprisingly calm. As always, he took the long view, as summarized in a reassuring letter to Cranston. The crisis may well further deepen, but this should not much discourage us, because it is often the case that formidable and proud opponents will only settle at the last moment and must actually look down into the abyss before they turn away. Now we are coming somewhere near to doing just that, and probably, if we now avoid a general war, as I think we will continue near the abyss for quite a long time. If this be so, people will continue more and more to be looking for a constructive way out. Clark was already at work on the blueprint for at least one way out. In 1950, he published A Plan for Peace. In 83 concise pages, it steps through the likely progression of a third world war, whether triggered deliberately or accidentally, and the specific and horrific consequences that each country, continent, and region would likely suffer as a result. It is a shockingly eyes-wide-open discussion with none of the usual euphemistic language, collateral damage, blowback, friendly fire, commonly used to deflect attention from the deadly consequences of military action. In his foreword, Clark acknowledges the Korean crisis, saying the Korean War, I believe, once more enforced the lesson that it is an illusion to expect peace in an armed and ungoverned world. The book came to be published in an unusual way. In the early anxious days following the invasion of South Korea, Clark received a very pressing invitation from friends on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to appear before it and go deeply into my ideas on world peace through world law. Ever protective of her husband's health, Fanny discouraged a Washington trip on the ground that to testify at length under pressure was the last thing in the world I should do. So Clark instead wrote up a thorough summary of those ideas for his senatorial friends. He tells the story from there. Somebody sent a copy of the statement I prepared to Cass Canfield of Harper's, who put it in a book. Senator Ralph Flanders, a friend of mine, read it and phoned me. I've written a letter to every member of the United States Senate about this book, he said. I want 95 copies of it, and I want them tomorrow morning. Can you get them here tomorrow morning? In the days before FedEx, there was no small request. That was no small request. But Clark found a rare air freight messenger, and the books were in Washington the next morning to be distributed along with Flanders' letter to all the other senators. Clark did eventually appear before both the Senate and the House subcommittees on foreign affairs to expand on his plan and answer questions. A copy, A Plan for Peace, was also sent to the Ford Foundation, where Paul Hoffman and Robert Maynard Hutchins were looking to fund peace research with Ford Motors Company abundant surplus profits. This was partly to reduce scrutiny by the Internal Revenue Service, but also to honor the late Henry Ford's well-known enthusiasm for peace. Hutchins spent a full day at Dublin discussing Clark's version of a world education program on international law and world government, starting with about a dozen centers around the globe. Hutchins was enthusiastic, but didn't balk at the tens of millions of dollars Clark suggested would likely be required. In fact, Hutchins suggested that it might be too little money for the declared purpose, and that it ought perhaps to be done on a greater scale. Clark got right to work on the project, and his files from 1951 and 1952 bulge with the voluminous related correspondence, including detailed drafts of the program, budgets, and so on. Then communication from the foundation suddenly stopped. It took some digging, but Clark eventually learned that this program was another Cold War casualty. Joseph McCarthy came along, and some friends on the corporation's board tipped me off that it was being said that my proposal was contrary to the policy of our government. Clark got a consolation prize of $25,000, a year for research, and a secretary for 5 years, and the chapter ended. He was naturally disappointed, but not entirely surprised. He maintained then and later that no foundation to this day, 1967, has done anything on an adequate scale for the cause of world order under law. Clark followed A Plan for Peace with the encyclopedic World Peace Through World Law, co-written with Louis Sohn, a Harvard professor and Dublin Conference alum. The book was published by Harvard University Press in 1958, with second, third, and fourth editions through 1973. The final version is a posthumous tribute to Clark by Sohn. In the book, Clark and Sohn systemically rewrite the entire United Nations Charter, article by article, to address what they saw as its crucial deficiencies. It was an astounding effort, translated into more than a dozen languages, including Russian and Arabic. The Arabic version was introduced by the then Professor Boutros Ghali of Egypt, who would become United Nations Secretary General, close parentheses. Clark's private distribution list for the book was impressive, One early mailing list was broken down into orderly subcategories, each recipient a personal friend. Governors 18, Senate 28, House 53, Cabinet 7, University Presidents 7, plus uncounted lawyers, ministers, organizations, heads of state, United Nations delegates, and more. Clark knew this audience well, and they knew him. The book carried added weight for not coming from an armchair theorist or political zealot. Each idea and prescription was firmly rooted in a lifetime of experience and observation of the U.S. government and the international system. As Sohn put it, Mr. Clark's unique experience as advisor to the Secretaries of State in war, his leading role in preparing the United States for 2 world wars, gave him an insight into the many problems which could not be easily matched. Sohn also appreciated Clark's extreme care with the text. He was forever trying to improve a text. He hated deadlines and resented the need to stop changing a draft in order to get a copy to the printer. He would sometimes revise a gallery or even a page proof completely, and the poor printer would have to start all over again. But the result of this tinkering was usually beneficial. The text would gain clarity, and the thought would come through not only for an expert, but even for an untortured layman. One such untortured layman was a head waiter at a Minneapolis hotel. The man became so intrigued by Clark's speech during a peace conference dinner that he brought home a copy of the 540-page World Peace Through World Law. Unsure whether he'd even begin to understand it, he took the plunge and began at the beginning. I read it through the night, and I did not find anything too difficult for me. Everything clearly explained, step by step, and everything fitted perfectly. For Clark, each person educated, whether head waiter or head of state, counted as a victory. On top of his major writing projects, Clark continued to lecture widely on world peace through world law, disarmament, and related topics. Simon Adebo, Nigeria's ambassador to the United Nations, once said, "Wherever 2 or 3 people were gathered to hold serious discussions on this subject, Grenville Clark was almost sure to be with them." Clark's speeches did not take place under practically auspicious circumstances in the early 1950s. The good news of damnation's powerful appeal immediately after Hiroshima and Nagasaki had lost much of its traction as fear of communism overtook fear of the bomb. "Better dead than red" was the slogan of the day, used even by normally measured individuals, including President Eisenhower. The Cold War was also having a predictably chilling effect on civil liberties in the United States. In 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy made his sensational charge that more than 200 known communists were working in the State Department. McCarthyism, in its full virulence, would define the decade, as anti-communist committees, panels, and loyalty review boards sprung up in the federal, state, and local governments, as well as many private enterprises bent on rooting out suspected communists in their midst. In response to the perceived scrutiny needs of the Cold War, Congress passed an anti-sedition and immigration control bills, and the Supreme Court approved imprisonment of legal Communist Party leaders. Republicans and Democrats alike fought to be perceived as more anti-communist than anyone else. One peace historian said after the early 1950s, only the lonely professed to doubt the need for a vigilant security state and the danger of subversives within the enemies without. If he was lonely, Grenville Clark didn't show it. He crisscrossed the country and the globe for peace-related conferences, perhaps all the more vigorously because of the hostile climate. London in 1951 and 1952, Copenhagen and Princeton in 1953, New York and Minneapolis in 1954, St. Louis in 1957. Many of these conferences were held under the auspices of the United World Federalists, to which Clark continued to offer advice and support. The United World Federalists was near its 1949 height with 47,000 members in 720 chapters across the United States, more than 150,000 people worldwide belonged to various Federalist groups. This was not a fringe liberal crowd by any means. Nearly 50 national associations, including the American Veterans Committee, National Grange, and Young Republicans, and many religious groups formally supported the United World Federalists. In early 1949, the governors of 9 states and the mayors of 50 American cities had proclaimed an official World Government Week. By mid-1950, 29 state legislatures had passed resolutions endorsing world government. That June, a bipartisan group of 91 members of the U.S. House of Representatives introduced a resolution supporting world federation as the fundamental objective of United States foreign policy. The resolution shortly had 111 co-sponsors in the House and Senate. The peace historian Loris Wittner acknowledges this unprecedented challenge to nationalism, ironically resulted in part from one version of nationalism itself, extrapolating the American federal government system to cover the entire world, but it also owed much to the widespread public feeling succinctly expressed by Cord Meyer that federation was the alternative to atomic war. Joseph Baratta, the scholar of record for the World Federalist Movement, notes that long study of great power politics may incline us to forget the hope and willingness that characterized the last year of World War II and at least a year thereafter. On this point, Baratta quotes William C. Bullitt, the former ambassador to the Soviet Union. After a great war like this, there comes a brief moment when world affairs are in a period of flux, or as Tom Paine would have put it, when we have it in our power to begin the world over again. Clark and the World Federalists strove to seize that brief moment. Beyond Clark's official and unofficial affiliations with organized peace groups, he found in his personal associations seemingly limitless opportunities to spread the word. Had Clark been a religious man, he would have made a superb missionary. He traveled the world to personally persuade heads of state on almost every continent of the logic of his ideas. In England, Clark became close to former Prime Minister Clement Attlee, an enthusiastic collaborator in the cause of peace. Even vacations were not exempt from peace work. In 1956, Grenville and Fanny took an all-around-the-world cruise on the Swedish ocean liner Kungsholm, and on the shore stop in India, the Clarks shared a memorable hour with Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, always learning as well as teaching. Clark observed the wretched conditions in the Southern Hemisphere and put world economic development and radical steps to deal with world poverty on his agenda and into his peace prescription from then on. That same cruise included another private detour, a visit with President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. Both Nehru and Nasser received copies of World Peace Through World Law in their native language. Clark had official or unofficial meetings with leaders in virtually every country of world prominence, including the Soviet Union. The one exception was China. Clark tried hard and sometimes ingeniously to get into communist China, but he never succeeded. In 1949, the Bamboo Curtain era began as the freshly victorious Mao government and the weary U.S. government became ever more mistrustful of each other. See Chapter 14 for details of Clark's efforts to break through that curtain, often through the journalist Edgar Snow, close parentheses. An important aspect of Clark's ongoing campaign to create a more effective United Nations is that he worked closely with people inside that organization as well as those on the outside. he formed strong collaborative associations with the United Nations officials and administrators at all levels. Many became personal friends, including Carlos Romulo of the Philippines, who was president of the General Assembly. Undersecretary Adebo and Muhammad Zafrullah Khan of Pakistan, head of International Court of Justice of the United Nations. Clark invited these leaders and forward thinkers and their wives to spend weekends in Dublin, in addition to meeting at conferences around the world. Clark undoubtedly complicated their lives with his relentless pursuit of a more perfect United Nations. Yet he greatly respected his extraordinary legal and historical grasp of their organizations. When Carlos Romulo mentioned Clark's work to the early and influential United Nations Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld of Sweden, not an easy man to impress, according to Romulo, close parentheses. Hammarskjöld said, "I have great respect for Grenville Clark. I think he knows the United Nations better than most of us do." Romulo agreed, recalling the spontaneous flow of Clark's knowledge of the United Nations and wisdom in the changes he wanted and made, and his sound proposals to correct them. His mind was a reservoir of great ideas on how to establish and maintain world peace. The enduring friendships established with Romulo and Khan Adebo and so many others were a hallmark of Clark's uniquely collaborative brand of agitation. In part to accommodate his nonstop work for peace, Clark resigned from the Harvard Corporation in 1950 after 20 years of continuous duty. The university acknowledged his long service with an honorary doctoral degree in law. Clark accepted the gesture graciously, but not without gentle humor. His reply to Henry Friendly's congratulatory letter is typical. "Dear Henry, it was awfully good of you to bother to write me about those honorary degrees." Clark had also recently received one from Princeton. Okay, yeah, just for funsies, I guess. I never had such a thing before. It was quite an experience to have two within 10 days. The Harvard degree wasn't so surprising because I did retire from the corporation last November after 20 years, and it is more or less customary there to give a degree to a former member who has served quite a while and hasn't done anything disgraceful. The one at Princeton, though, was a complete surprise. Clark received a third honorary degree in 1953, this time from Dartmouth. Okay, so just more funsies. Clark's Plattsburgh and War Department ally, John McCloy, was honored at the same ceremony, and President Eisenhower gave the keynote address. But the real pleasure was accepting the award from John Dickley, a close longtime friend of Clark's, close parentheses. Although Clark had deeply enjoyed his years on the corporation board, his tenure on it ended uncomfortably for all involved. Clark and the Harvard president he helped appoint, James B. Conant, had become close friends and allies on world peace activities, among other things. Clark summarized his Harvard association in a brief biographical sketch for the 50th reunion of his 1903 class. Apart from the invaluable friendships, I look back on my 7 years at Cambridge and 20 years on the corporation as worthwhile and a privilege. The relationship should have glided peacefully into the New England sunset, but that was not to be. A disagreement involving Harvard's Arnold Arboretum began while Clark was still on the corporation, but was not resolved until after he left. The Arboretum is located in Boston, across the Charles River from Harvard's Cambridge campus, but it is administered by Harvard under a trust set up by the Arboretum's original donors. At issue was whether Harvard's botany department would be permitted to dip into the Arboretum's endowment to fund some of its own projects in Cambridge. Clark and other passionate friends of the Arboretum insisted that the trust instrument defined the purpose of the Arboretum as horticulture, which meant its resources could be used only to directly maintain and improve the Arboretum's extensive collection of trees, plants, flowers, and other flora. The funds could not be diverted to the botany department or any other department for any other purpose. The disagreement escalated and ended up in court. Expert witnesses testified about the differences between horticulture and botany. This is a very snooty thing to be fighting around. If the issue seems esoteric and differences between the two sides like hair splitting, the emotions the Arboretum controversy aroused were real and intense. The Arnold Arboretum was given to Harvard in the 1800s and soon became a cherished historic landmark in Boston, a city that takes historic landmarks seriously. It was beloved by Bostonians, none more so than Fanny Dwight Clark, who had been visiting it since she was a little girl. Perhaps Fanny, with her deep affection for the place, combined with her professional level interest and skill in horticulture, rallied her husband. Whatever the impetus, Grenville Clark made clear he was horrified that Harvard was not honoring the terms of the Arnold's gift, even though he had initially approved the diversion to botany while he was on the corporation board, and even though the donor was long dead and the reason for the diversion of resources potentially valid, close parentheses. The disagreement escalated when Clark threatened to drag his famously private university into court over the matter. Conant became enraged, publicly accusing Clark of dirty pool. For its part, Harvard did not exactly behave nobly, apparently treating certain of the Arboretum people quite shabbily. According to one historian, it got personal. Harvard wouldn't go see the other side without having a lawyer with them. Harvard prevailed after a nasty fight, and Clark and Conant never really forgave each other. Lasting effects on Harvard seem to have been minimal. Both its Arnold Arboretum and botany department thrive to this day, but the controversy effectively ended the two men's friendship, or at least reduced to occasional forced pleasantries what had been close personal and collaborative association. Conant did contribute an eloquent essay for the book of memoirs Clark's older daughter collected upon her father's death. The controversy had one happy, if unintended, consequence. It brought Grenville Clark into contact with George Avery of the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. Avery was both a botanist and a horticulturist, and therefore a perfect expert witness for the highly nuanced Arboretum case. During the lengthy legal contest, the two men became good friends. The Averys visited Dublin, and the Clarks toured the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. The Clarks' admiration for Avery's impressive operation inspired them to donate their family home on Long Island and its 12 acres to the Brooklyn Botanic Garden after the family's death. Clark had formally retired from Root Clark in 1946 if he did not exactly follow the related strategy of relaxing into the life of a gentleman farmer and armchair memoirist. He did at least give up the active practice of law. Old ties beckoned, however, and on October 1st, 1954, Grenville Clark and his former partner and lifelong friend, Elihu Root Jr., became of counsel to the Wall Street firm Cleary, Gottlieb, Friendly, and Ball. The designation was a mark of prestige and respect, much as when the young Root Clark partners had summarily appointed Elihu Root Sr. as counsel to their own fledgling firm at the outbreak of World War I. The two law firms were directly linked, as 4 of the original 5 Clear-Gola partners, including the future federal judge Henry Friendly, had early Root Clark and Bird pedigrees. It was a happy reunion for all parties, and the normally restrained senior partner, Leo Gottlieb, practically gushed. It is almost impossible to express adequately the importance to our firm of the event. It is not too much to say that it placed our firm in a brand new class. It transformed the firm from any number of small firms of good reputation for character and competence to a firm which would have to be regarded as an important Wall Street firm plainly destined to become one of the big league. There is no accolade, no citation, no honor of any kind that could have meant more to us than the willingness of Elihu Root Jr. and Grenville Clark to become identified with our relatively small offshoot of Root Clark and to lend their names and prestige to the image we present to the world. In 1954, Root, who initiated the of-counsel role for the two former partners, was still in active law practice, in addition to serving on the boards of large corporations and civic organizations. He, by design, became an active partner at Cleargalaw. For Clark, of the off-counsel designation was mainly symbolic, although he was very keen on the proposed arrangement and looked forward to renewing contact with many old Root Clark and friends now at Cleargalaw. It was understood that Clark would spend virtually all his time at Dublin working on his own public service projects. At his insistence, he received no pay, did not take an office at the firm, and was not assigned a secretary. He was available mainly for consultation by telephone and by mail, and made occasional trips to New York for meetings and conferences. The affiliation pleased Clark greatly. Perhaps more than he anticipated, both he and Root continued in their advisory roles until their deaths within a few months of each other in 1967. All was not pure harmony in Clark's relationship with the legal establishment, however. He was dismayed to see the resurgence of loyalty oaths, which he had battled decades before on behalf of teachers, now cropping up with alarming frequency across a range of professions. The final insult came when the oaths arrived at his own American Bar Association. The association president opened the annual ABA convention in 1950 with an insidious warning echoing similar calls being sounded across the country. We are faced with an attack from within our form of government and our society and our way of life by foreign ideologies. The ABA membership responded with a reactionary solution to what Clark saw as a hysterically inflated problem, recommending mandatory loyalty oaths for all new and existing members of the bar, the idea which should have been insistently repugnant to trained guardians of the Constitution was instead approved with less discussion than would have been devoted to the menu at the next annual banquet. This grim account was reported to Clark by Zechariah Chaffee, co-author of the amicus brief for the Minersville versus Gobitis flag saluting case back in the Civil Rights Committee days. Another veteran of that committee, Ross Malone, said of the oaths, "I must confess that having had some small part in the glorious past of the Bill of Rights Committee, I was perhaps more disturbed than the average person to see the ABA's perverted efforts on that occasion." After agreeing to self-imposed loyalty oaths, the ABA established the Special Committee to study communist tactics, strategy, and objectives, the antithesis in motive and operation of the Bill of Rights Committee, organized by the same body just 9 years earlier. Clark fumed. He allowed Chaffee to fight the fight, but offered his customary behind-the-scenes counsel in support. Clark wrote to Malone that the suppiness of the ABA appalled them, just as had the effective death of their cherished Bill of Rights Committee after Clark left it. In 1959, the suppiness of the Supreme Court drew Clark's ear. In December of that year, Dr. Willard Uphouse, an elderly and eccentric New Hampshire pacifist and Methodist minister, was in prison because of his continued refusal to provide New Hampshire authorities with the names of hundreds of people who had visited his World Fellowship summer camps. Uphouse had been the target of a 1953 investigation led by Firebrand State Attorney General Louis Wyman to root out subversive persons under the 1951 New Hampshire State Subversive Activities Act. Uphouse had cooperated fully with Wyman in discussing and disclosing his own activities, but Uphouse steadfastly refused to name his visitors, convinced that Wyman's sole purpose in seeking their names was to harass Uphouse's guests, as Uphouse himself was being harassed for their lawful but allegedly unpatriotic pacifist views. Wyman then prosecuted Uphouse, whose defense was three-pronged. First, he cited the biblical command not to bear false witness against his brother. Next, he cited the teachings of the Methodist Church to uphold civil and religious rights and to condemn guilt by association. Finally, Uphouse held a copy of the Bill of Rights and said, "I love this document and I propose to uphold it with the full strength and power of my spirit and intelligence." Uphouse was convicted, appealed, and the New Hampshire Supreme Court sided with Wyman. In 1959, Uphouse appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The High Court ultimately upheld the New Hampshire ruling in a 5-4 decision, with Clark's increasingly conservative friend Felix Frankfurter in the majority. The verdict left Uphouse to be imprisoned, potentially indefinitely, unless and until he abandoned his conscientious objections and disclosed names of his guests to state authorities. Uphouse, the theologian of strong conviction, remained firm, and so did the state of New Hampshire. Enter Grenville Clark. In December 1959, 3 days after Uphouse was incarcerated at the Merrimack County Jail, there to remain for 1 year or until he purges himself of contempt or until further orders of this court, Clark had written to the governor of New Hampshire, Wesley Powell, urging Uphouse's immediate release. Powell did not respond. Grenville Clark made it his mission to have the Uphouse case re-argued before the U.S. Supreme Court at his own expense. The 77-year-old Clark tapped a pair of talented younger lawyers to help with the enormous work of preparing and presenting a Supreme Court case. They were Robert Reno, a respected New Hampshire lawyer and world peace advocate, Louis Lusky, a former Root Clark associate and Bill of Rights committee member, now practicing law in Louisville, Kentucky. Clark would personally cover all costs. The veteran lawyer stayed in the background, but daily advised the younger men by telephone, wire, and/or letter. Reno recalled Clark's expert guidance. His analysis of the legal niceties of the case was superb, and his direction of both strategy and tactics indicated why he was one of the great lawyers of the 20th century. Clark understood the power of public opinion and worked the press with an open letter in local newspapers summarizing his case. I regard the jailing of Dr. Uphouse as a clearing injustice, which is a disgrace to New Hampshire and a discredit to our country. I also believe that this continued detention in jail because, for reasons of conscience, he would not disclose certain names is unconstitutional under our federal constitution. And I believe the legal issues, some of them new, should be reconsidered by the Supreme Court of the United States. These are the reasons why I have assumed the legal expenses of the new proceedings. It is a privilege to help in the effort to remedy this shocking injustice. Clark's team worked through the summer of 1960, but when the U.S. Supreme Court opened its session that fall, the Uphouse appeal came up 1 vote short of the 4 needed to grant the hearing. aka granting certiorari, or to grant cert in legal lingo. Only Associate Justices Hugo Black and William Douglas and Chief Justice Earl Warren voted to rehear the Uphouse case. In an unusual move of the three justices in the minority wrote formal dissenting opinions. Black's dissent was a particularly eloquent affirmation of free speech and free assembly. In it, he addresses squarely an issue long close to Clark's heart and career, defending the protections in the Bill of Rights. I think the summary dismissal of this appeal without even so much as the benefit of oral argument when the abridgment of the rights of free speech and assembly is so obvious is a sad indication of just how far this court has already departed from the protections of the Bill of Rights and an omen of things yet to come. Clark, who had vehemently opposed Black's appointment by FDR in 1937, in part because Black, a Southerner, had once been a member of the Ku Klux Klan, sent a congratulatory letter on the justice's 75th birthday the following February. Mr. Justice Black, on your 75th birthday, please accept my respect and admiration for your inspiring example on the court, and my best wishes for a further period of fruitful work. You struck a strong blow for the rights of conscience with your superb opinion. I wish you many years of health and vigor, Grenville Clark. Black quickly replied, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate the message you sent of me on February 27th, my 75th birthday. While I have never had an intimate acquaintance with you, I have known through the years about the public service you have given so unselfishly, Hugo Black. But what of Uphouse? New Hampshire authorities quietly released him on December 12, 1960, 2 days before his original 1 year, but potentially renewable jail term ended. He left the state and the matter officially ended. Clark was, of course, disappointed by the Supreme Court ruling, but assured his young associates that the effort we have made has been well worth it from my point of view. He was buoyed by the strong dissents of Justices Black and Douglas, and in any case, Clark cared most for results, and Uphouse was free. Clark also understood there was more than one way to solve a problem. The intense pressure he and his team brought to bear in the case had mattered whether it led directly to Uphouse's release or not. Had the elderly theologian been rearrested as threatened, Clark, the complete lawyer, had detailed plans already drawn up for 3 different potential prosecution strategies. Despite his differences with the American Bar Association over loyalty oaths and other issues, the ABA in 1959 awarded Grenville Clark its highest honor, the American Bar Association Medal for conspicuous service to the cause of the American jurisprudence, placing him in the company of legal legends like Elihu Root Sr., Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., and Charles Evan Hughes Jr. Clark accepted the medal, gave a gracious acceptance speech, and then undoubtedly filed both with his growing collection of such things. His greatest enjoyment surely came from the calls and letters from friends and associates. Felix Frankfurter, still a close friend despite their widening philosophical divide, summed the situation up nicely. Dear Grenny, the American Bar Association couldn't honor you, but it honored itself by formal recognition of your intrinsic worth and high uses to which you put it. In crowning you, the ABA has done a valuable thing in advertising you as a symbol of what is honorable and distinguished in the eyes of our profession. Affectionately and fondly yours, Felix. Honors and awards aside, Clark tried to keep his customary low profile and avoid the glare and tentacles of an official public role. This required vigilance. He continued to be sought out for both private and government consulting positions. as in this 1951 offer from the Truman administration. Last evening, Averell Harriman phoned me from the White House about the commission announced on the radio yesterday p.m. and the press this a.m., of which Admiral Nimitz is to be chairman. Harriman, for the president, asked me to serve. I declined because of other commitments and not for lack of interest. The commission had been created to investigate and report on the balancing of national security and civil rights concerns, which would have been right up Clark's alley. As with virtually every such offer, he declined. It is tantalizing to speculate how he might have shaken things up had he accepted. Clark and Harriman's close ties span more than 50 years. In a poignant memorial essay, Harriman was clearly touched that Clark gave me the feeling he was interested in matters that concerned me and offered considerate encouragement whenever I sought his advice. In this case, that encouragement resulted in the referral of several other potential candidates for this post in lieu of acceptance. While Clark continued to deflect official appointments, he took seriously his role as a community member. He joined Dublin's Unitarian Church, finding a natural fit with the Unitarians' emphasis on freedom of thought and relative lack of dogma. In 1952, the church struggled to find a new pastor for its tiny congregation, then 18 members. Funding was as scant as the membership, offering little financial security for the pastor. Clark was not a member of the official search committee, but when he learned of a promising applicant, he stepped in to privately scrutinize the new man. Determining that Lynn Rutledge passed muster, Clark took him aside for a private conversation. To mitigate any personal financial risk, Clark told Rutledge if he agreed to stay, Clark would personally guarantee the pastor's salary and all expenses for a full 6 months, including a proviso in his will should he die in the meantime. Rutledge accepted and was continually astonished by Clark's quiet subsidies, including paying in full the considerable medical bills when the pastor underwent a major surgery in 1953. Clark's only stipulation was that no one should know. Envelopes with encouraging notes and even more encouraging checks or wards of cash that arrived out of the blue were routine. When Rutledge presided at Clark's memorial service at the Dublin Unitarian Church 15 years later after their original 6-month agreement, the sadness, affection, and admiration in his eulogy were real. Clark's civic engagement expanded well beyond his community church. Clark and Fanny were both vigorous participants in town improvement and preservation projects. They deeded the land and access rights for a public landing and parking area on Dublin Lake, helped plan and put on Dublin's bicentennial celebration in 1952, and spearheaded a large, successful citizen campaign to save Mount Monadnock from the unsightly proposed radio tower. They contributed to the Dublin Garden Club, Dublin School, Society for Protection of the New Hampshire Forests, and other local improvement groups, in demonstrating that civic and community improvement begins at home. The Clarks' meticulously managed outlet farm tended Fanny's exquisite garden and kept an outdoor for their circle of families and neighbors. As the 1950s came to a close, Grenville Clark looked forward to the next decade, which would be his last.